Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now in the last video we looked at the first few positions as such of Harry Nelson Pillsbury, who is the current master we're looking at. We never actually looked at any of Pillsbury's full games. However, we did look at some positions that occurred in Pillsbury's games where he was able to get a breakthrough on one of the flanks. Now, this is a full game of Pillsbury's now. It's game number 35 in the book, and it's the only game of Pillsbury that we're going to look at. Now, in this game, Pillsbury has the white pieces, and his opponent, Georg has the black pieces. Pillsbury starts off with d4, d5, c4. We have the Queen's Gambit. So as we've discussed before, black now has two decisions to make as to how they defend this pawn. Knight f6 fails to c takes d4, knight takes d4, e4. So black has to play either e6, which is potentially a bit more solid and orthodox. So Queen's Gambit declined, defending the pawn, and that allows black to push c5 in one move. However, it will have pawns on e6 and d5, which would block in this bishop. Or black can play c6, going into the semi-Slav. That would free up this bishop. However, it does mean that when black almost always wants to play c5, they're going to have to play. They would have already wasted a move with c6 to go to c5. Now in this game, Georg plays e6, knight c3. We have knight f6, so knight c3 controlling e4, opening e4 push. Knight f6 stopping e4. Bishop g5 pinning the knight. Bishop e7 unpinning the knight. And now e3. e3 played once the bishop's outside of the pawn chain. Castles. Knight f3. And now b6. And now, as I was saying at the start, one of the drawbacks of e6 is that this bishop becomes very difficult to develop. And I know in a previous game, Reti commented that in the Queen's Gambit declined, where you have pawns on d5 and e6, a key theme of that is how you develop your bishop. And if you're able to develop the light square bishop to an active square in the Queen's Gambit declined, which is exceptionally difficult to do so with going for an active square rather than just normal development, then you have solved all of your problems. Now Reti comments that fianchettoing the bishop on b6 was one of the most common defenses in the 1900s. It's less common now, but it isn't fully refuted. However, Reti comments that playing b6 here right now is it isn't that good. He says that playing knight d7 was perhaps safer. Knight d7 before pushing b6, because there is a fairly dangerous attack that Marshall played against a premature fianchetto of the bishop, which we will see later on. I believe Marshall is one of the future masters that we're going to look at. Now here we see bishop to d3, bishop to b7, fianchettoing the bishop, c takes d5, and e takes d5. Now this pawn exchange, Reti comments, is only really... Black usually waits before the exchange pawns here, because if they let's just waste a move. If white exchanged pawns right now, then this bishop would be free. So black waits to white waits until black has fianchettoed this bishop and committed it to this diagonal before they exchange pawns. Now, in this position, Pillsbury played a knight to e5. And this is the famous Pillsbury attack. And in fact, if you put this into chess.com, it tells you what opening it is, and it actually calls it the Pillsbury attack. Now, Pillsbury has successfully pulled off this attack several times. The knight jumps to e5, and it will be quite secure there after f4 is potentially pushed. However, this attack is perhaps seen to be a bit more dubious these days. Reti comments that instead, against this fianchettoed bishop, it may be a bit better to try and gain some counterplay on the queen side, especially given that we have got a Carlsbad pawn structure, wherein you've got 2 pawns against against 3, I guess, if you want to look at it, and then you've got the kingside majority here. So White's usual plan in a Carlsbad pawn structure, ignoring all the pieces, is to try and get a minority attack and essentially push these pawns to create some weak squares in Black's queen side that you can then use as an outpost at later points. Now here we see knight b to d7, f4, and c5. So Black, with c5, they can, I guess, be trying to free up their position and just try and free up some of their pieces with potential pawn exchanges. However, Reti comments that Black is actually hoping to push c4, because then after c4, they will then have 3 pawns on the queen side versus White's 2 pawns on the queen side. So if they are able to push those pawns and mobilize them and exchange 1 pawn for another 1 pawn, so exchange this pawn for this pawn, this pawn for this pawn, they will be left with a singular pawn, a passed pawn, which can be a very useful tool. You know, a passed pawn, you don't need to. A passed pawn is obviously 1 step closer to being a queen. So that's what Black was hoping with this c4 push. However, this isn't quite fast enough, because whilst Black was pushing on the queen side, White was able to get a very strong and very quick attack on the queen side. Now, Reti comments that instead of this, Black should have perhaps tried to exploit some of the weaknesses in White's position, namely this weak e4 pawn, the backwards pawn, and potentially this weak this weak e3 pawn, and potentially the weak e4 square as a consequence. Reti comments that perhaps trying to exchange knights, and after the knight goes back and everything's exchanged, that Black may then try and push f6 to try and trade these pawns off, and then have open lines to this weak pawn. No, I don't know if this move order quite works, but that was the general idea. So let's say castles. So this was a general idea that we now have this weak pawn which can be easily attacked by Black. Now, I don't think this way quite worked, but yeah, you could have just taken the pawn right here. But that's the idea which Reti gives as a alternative plan for Black, to try and exploit this weak pawn here. However, Black pushes c5, White castles, and now we see c4, going with Black's original plan, trying to create a passed pawn and a bit of a pawn majority on the queen side. So we see bishop to c2, a6, preparing to advance the pawns on the queen side. Obviously this will just be captured, so a6 is needed first to push b5. And then we see queen to f3. And now White still got the advantage, but they have to, yeah, white has got an advantage now, but after b5, white's advantage increases quite a lot. It's too late for black now. Queen to h3. Black was sort of ignoring the build-up of forces on his king side. Now the computer line here can be fairly interesting. In the game we see g6, but the computer line is actually really quite interesting. Knight takes e5 is a computer line, where after d takes e5, we have knight to e4, knight takes e4, d takes e4, and now rook a to d1 attacking the queen. And here the computer actually just wants you to take here, because after you take, it's a bit more equal material, I guess. It's a queen for a rook and a bishop, and black's got the bishop pair. Although rook d1 could come, and you could quite easily get control of the 7th rank if you really wanted it, especially with the queen controlling the square. Now, of course, in this position, the threat, if you just try to move the queen to defend the bishop, is rook d7, which still attacks this bishop, attacks the queen, and x-rays this bishop, and it's defended by the white queen. So that's the threat almost. It's quite a nice little line, and it may well be that Pillsbury saw something quite similar to this. I'm sliding down my chair. However, so so after queen h3, that was sort of the computer line of knight takes e5, which was what the computer said was the best line for black. But instead we see g6, and now f5. So with this g6 move, they created a bit of a hook for Pillsbury to break through by pushing f5 in. However, Marco continues on the queen side. He doesn't quite respond to this threat. He continues with b4. Now so Pillsbury takes on g6. Note that, so here Marco takes back on g6. If Marco took the knight on c3, then it's actually mate in 6. We have rook takes f6. So the threat now is taking here with mate, because the knight is no longer guarding this. So bishop takes this mate in 1. So if you take with a knight, then bishop takes f6, and the threat here is still quite significant. Let's say you take here, but then queen to e6 check, and you have to block because the king can't move because of the bishop. So that'd be mate. The computer actually recommends after rook takes here to take on g6, so you've just almost given up the knight at worst case scenario, but it is still mate. Rook takes g6 check, h takes g6, and bishop takes g6. So now again we're threatening mate. Knight to f6 to try and stop mate, bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, queen h7 check, king f8, and queen h8 mate. That's the mating line which the computer gives. But the main thing is that if he took the knight, it would be mate in 6. Now I don't know if Pillsbury and Marco saw the mate in 6, but they very likely would have seen that rook, the idea of rook taking on f6, and that knight takes f6 still doesn't quite work. So because of that, after f takes g6, we see h takes g6, not taking this knight just yet. And now queen to h4 generates a bit of a double attack, or an x-ray along here. B takes c3, but now knight takes d7. And after queen takes here, rook takes f6, a5. So there's obviously quite a lot of threats along here. if you take the rook, then bishop takes f6, and there's no real way to really try and stop this. The only way you can really stop it is by just trying to sacrifice your queen and delay it. Even now, there's just nothing you can do to try and stop this attack. So that was the threat. So Marco tries to play a5 here, hoping to bring in the rook to a6, which isn't a bad idea, but it's just a bit too slow. Because rook a to f1, and all of white's pieces are in the attack. Now rook a6, and now we see bishop takes g6. Now in the game we saw f takes g6. Again, if we saw something like bishop takes f6, queen h7 is mate. So black had to take this bishop and g6. So f takes g6. But now we have rook takes f8. Bishop takes f8 is the only real move. Now rook takes f8 check. King takes f8. Queen h8 check. King f7. Queen h7 check. And in this position, black resigned. Black is up a rook, but it's mate in 3. So if you go to queen e6, then queen takes g6 is mate. If you go to e8, then queen to g8 is mate. The only move to delay mate is queen f8. Is king f8. But this actually just gives up the queen, and it's mate in 2. Mate's just unstoppable. Let's say you just waste a bit of a move. Well, bishop h6 check, king has to go there, and queen to g7 is mate. So after forcing the black pawn to take the bishop, Pillsbury then sacrificed the rook, or sacrificed the exchange, to try and bring his queen in, and after king f7, queen h7 check, black resigned. So again, we saw another instance where Pillsbury was able to break through on the king's side quite fast with this f5. It was the f4, f5 pawn break initially. He saw that black weakened the position a bit with g6, so he pushed f5, f4. And so there we have it. That was the Queen's Gambit declined Pillsbury attack. Now, the book Masters of the Chessboard is actually split into 2 sections. You have the Masters of the past and the modern Masters. Now, obviously, the book itself is very old. It's why I can do this, because it's outside of copyright. However, what this means is that the modern Masters are actually still quite old. I think it starts with masters like Maroczy and Capablanca and Rubinstein and things, and finishes with Alexander Alekhine. So this is the last video of Harry Nelson Pillsbury, and the last of the older masters. The next video we will be looking at the games by Maroczy, who will be the first modern master as such. So if you like this video, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.